At 11:30 in the morning on December 22, 1944, 4 German soldiers walked slowly toward American lines outside the Belgian town of Bastogne. 2 of them carried long white flags, held stiffly in the cold air as they moved across the snow-covered no-man's land. Leading the group were Major Wagner and Lieutenant Helmut Haenke, followed by 2 enlisted men of the 901st Panzergrenadier Regiment. They carried a typed message, one version in German, one in English, an ultimatum demanding the surrender of the American forces holding Bastogne. The men expected a formal response, maybe a period of negotiation, perhaps even signs of American hesitation. What they received instead would become one of the most famous replies in military history. Inside the town, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe commanded the surrounded garrison. The 101st Airborne Division, along with attached armor, artillery, engineers, and support units, about 11,000 American troops in total. McAuliffe, a 46-year-old career artillery officer from Washington, D.C., was not a man of theatrics or poetic speeches. He was steady, calm, and direct, the kind of commander who rarely used profanity. When frustrated, he simply said, "Nuts," a harmless, clipped exclamation that his staff had long recognized as his personal way of saying something utterly ridiculous. He had taken command only because the division's commander, General Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington and the assistant commander was in England. But at this moment, in this snowbound Belgian town under siege, McAuliffe was exactly the commander the 101st Airborne needed. The situation was grim. 6 days earlier, the German army had launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes. More than 400,000 German troops, supported by over 1,000 tanks, smashed through thin American defenses. The goal of Hitler's last major offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, was to split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate. Bastogne, with its 7 major roads and its rail line, sat at the crossroads of the region. Whoever held Bastogne controlled all movement in the area. For the Germans, the town was essential. For the Americans, it had become a fortress. The 101st had been rushed from its rest area in France, traveling more than 100 miles in open trucks through freezing winter air. They arrived after dark on December 18th and 19th, barely ahead of the German armored spearheads closing around the town. By the morning of December 20th, Bastogne was encircled. With no way out and no supply lines in, the Americans were outnumbered at least 3-1. Ammunition, food, and medical supplies were running dangerously low. Artillery crews rationed their fire to only 10 rounds per gun per day. Soldiers fought in thin uniforms meant for summer, not the sub-zero temperatures of an Ardennes winter. Frostbite cases grew daily. Wounded men lay in improvised aid stations with almost no morphine and too few bandages. German forces pressing in on all sides included elite armored divisions, units equipped with tanks far heavier and more powerful than anything the Americans had in the town. The German commander responsible for taking Bastogne, General Heinrich von Luttwitz, believed the Americans must recognize the hopelessness of their position. He had already accepted the surrender of 2 American regiments earlier in the offensive, where more than 7,000 men had laid down their arms. He expected Bastogne to follow the same pattern, especially once he offered what he considered generous terms. His ultimatum promised honorable treatment under the Geneva Convention and warned that if the Americans refused, German artillery and air forces would reduce Bastogne to rubble. The note gave the Americans 2 hours to reply. When the German delegation approached the American lines near the village of Marvy, they were stopped by an outpost from F Company of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. The soldiers, suspicious and cold, blindfolded the Germans and summoned their commanders. The message was passed up the chain, company, battalion, regiment, division, until finally it reached division headquarters. McAuliffe was sleeping when Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore woke him. Still groggy, the general asked if the Germans wished to surrender. Moore corrected him. The Germans wanted the Americans to surrender. McAuliffe blinked in disbelief, then irritation. He read the formal, polite German message carefully. When he finished, he muttered the first word that came naturally to him, "Nuts." He tossed the paper aside and prepared to leave, but Moore reminded him that the Germans were waiting for a formal written reply. Military protocol demanded it. McAuliffe sighed and, after a moment's thought, declared that his one-word reaction was all the response they needed. That was the reply. Nuts. Moore hesitated. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard hesitated. Both tried to convince the general that the Germans might not understand slang. McAuliffe refused to budge. Someone typed the message neatly onto division letterhead. To the German commander. Nuts. The American commander. 4 words in total. Colonel Joseph Harper of the 327th Glider Infantry was given the task of delivering it. As he drove to the front lines, he thought about the strangeness of this mission, handing an insult to enemy officers who outnumbered and surrounded his entire division. But Harper understood the deeper purpose. The reply was not really for the Germans at all. It was for the American soldiers shivering in foxholes around Bastogne. They needed to know their commander had no intention of surrendering. Harper reached the waiting German officers, who removed their blindfolds and stood stiffly in the cold. They expected negotiations. Instead, Harper handed them the single sheet of paper. Major Wagner read it slowly, frowning, confused. "What does this mean?" he asked. Harper explained that if they needed a translation, it meant, "Go to hell." The Germans were stunned. Wagner tried to argue, insisting that the American commander did not understand the situation, that resistance was pointless, that destruction was guaranteed, that civilians would suffer. Harper cut him off. The Americans understood perfectly. The reply stood. If the Germans wanted Bastogne, they would have to attack immediately, because, Harper warned, the weather was about to clear, and when it did, American aircraft would make German positions untenable. It was a bluff. But within 24 hours, it became the truth. That evening, word of McAuliffe's reply spread through the perimeter like electricity. Men repeated it in foxholes, whispered it in aid stations, shouted it across gun pits. It lifted spirits instantly. The men of the 101st had been exhausted, freezing, hungry, and running low on hope. But now they had a story, something bold, defiant, and unmistakably American. Their general had told the Germans exactly what they all wished they could say. The next day, December 23rd, the weather finally broke. Fog cleared. Clouds lifted. The sky turned bright and cold. And then the men saw them, American aircraft. Hundreds of C-47 transport planes roared overhead, dropping parachutes filled with ammunition, food, medical supplies, fuel, and winter clothing. Nearly all of it landed inside American lines. Fighter bombers followed, P-47 Thunderbolts swooping low to strafe and bomb German positions around the perimeter. Harper's bluff had become reality, and the effect on morale was overwhelming. The defenders felt hope surge through them. The Germans, on the other hand, watched their armored columns and artillery positions take fire from above and realized the siege had entered a new phase. Von Luttwitz renewed his attacks, desperate now to seize the town before relief arrived. German infantry and tanks hammered the American lines on December 23rd, 24, and 25. The fighting was brutal, house to house in some places, hand to hand in others. Artillery thundered constantly. The perimeter bent but never broke. The 101st held on. Meanwhile, 30 miles to the south, General George Patton was executing one of the most extraordinary maneuvers of the war. He had turned his entire Third Army northward, 200,000 men, tanks, artillery, and supply columns, pivoting 90 degrees in the middle of winter and driving toward Bastogne. The spearhead of the relief force was the 4th Armored Division, led by Combat Command B and by the aggressive, fearless tank commander Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. On December 26th, Abrams and his battalion smashed through the final German roadblocks. At 4:50 in the afternoon, an American Sherman tank named Cobra King, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Bogus, rolled into contact with the 101st Airborne's outer lines. Moments later, Abrams shook hands with General McAuliffe. The siege of Bastogne was over. The relief of Bastogne marked the turning point of the Battle of the Bulge. The German offensive stalled, then collapsed. They had committed their last reserves and lost them. Fuel, tanks, and manpower could not be replaced. The momentum shifted permanently to the Allies. In the United States, newspapers published the story of McAuliffe's reply, and the country loved it. It captured the American spirit, brave, informal, irreverent in the face of danger. Even Winston Churchill asked for an explanation of the slang and declared the Battle of the Bulge the greatest American battle of the war. The story spread among Allied troops, German prisoners, and eventually the world. McAuliffe himself remained modest. He insisted the reply had not been heroic. It was just the first word that came to mind. But for the soldiers who defended Bastogne, that simple word symbolized everything. It told them their commander believed they could hold. It reminded them of who they were. It became part of the 101st Airborne's identity for generations. Even today, the original typed message sits preserved in the National Archives. The site where the Germans delivered their ultimatum is marked by a monument carved with a single word: nuts. It stands there in the Belgian countryside, a reminder that sometimes, in the darkest and coldest moments, a single word, spoken with conviction, can help turn the tide of history. If you enjoyed this story and want more long-form explorations of forgotten or incredible moments from the Second World War, please like this video and subscribe. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from, and whether your family has any connection to Bastogne or the Battle of the Bulge. Thank you for helping keep these memories alive.